Teaching has been on my mind for the last few months for a variety of reasons. And the, let's say, pretty much inciting incident is that I was talking to somebody relatively recently about his experience training with a specific instructor, somebody that I had recommended they would go train with. Now, I know this person well, this instructor, in the sense that I know how competent he is as a martial artist, as a practitioner, and so on. So I had advised that young man to train with this guy. Now, his experience was both positive and negative. Obviously, he clearly saw the high level of competence, but there are also some issues with the way that that instructor teaches, and I'll get into that in a little bit. The second reason why I'm so much thinking about teaching for the last few months is this. This is my 5th year on Patreon. It's been a wild ride. It's been amazing to see the support that I've received for all those years from so many people. Dozens and dozens and dozens of people have supported my work. I've done my utmost to always produce high quality content. I make a lot of videos and instructional material there and so on. And for the 5th year, I wanted to do something special and asked for some requests. What do you guys want? And one of the requests kind of caught my eye, and that was to do something about teaching and learning and so on. So the request was, well, Wim, you've been teaching for such a long time. Could you do something with that? And I started thinking about it, and then it's true. I've been teaching for over 30 years now. So the more I thought about it, the more I thought this was an excellent project to work on. So that's what I've been working on for a few months now, and it's steady progress, but still not there. But anyway, that's going to be a bonus reward for all my patrons that is coming up. And as I was talking to this young man, this kind of popped into my mind as I, like I said, have been thinking about teaching for so many months now, very intensely, and writing down outline and so on. Now, what were some of the things that he thought was an issue with this specific teacher? Well, there are several that I could recognize from the explanation that the young man gave me. And first of all, the teacher overteaches. This is very common. So he gives lots and lots of detail, and that is not bad in and of itself. However, often as a teacher, when you do that, and I fall in that category as well, I tend to overteach as opposed to underteach. But what often happens is that if you are not careful, you end up giving too much information for the skill level of that student or the class that you're teaching. So let's say you're teaching a beginner class. They're already trying to figure things out. Everything is relatively new to them. And in a beginner class, let's say that I will, you know, I would put in there anybody just starting out his first class up to like a year, maybe 2 years, depending on the art that you teach. But for a lot of those folks, if you go into too much detail, they just don't have the knowledge base yet to fully grasp what you're teaching. So then it becomes information overload, and it's just really, really difficult for them to keep track of what you're saying because it's just so much detail and they have to process continuously. And as a result, they just don't get it because you might, as a teacher, then mention something in passing like, okay, well, there's also this aspect or this detail. And in your mind, it's very clear because you do have that experience and that context. But for the student, it is completely just overwhelming. Another thing that that teacher did was he is apparently very unstructured. Now, this is something that I knew beforehand, but I didn't know to which extent that was actually an issue or not. So what happens is he starts explaining one technique, and then, as he's explaining it, he's thinking about it, goes off on a tangent, and that is interesting in and of itself, but then leads him down a different path, and then he starts explaining something else. And that goes on for 5 minutes, and the final part of the explanation is perhaps a technique that is something completely different from the first technique he showed. And then he says to the students, okay, go, start training. But the students don't know which technique he wants them to train because he's been going on for so long, has shown so many different things, that are seemingly unrelated, again, for the students. Maybe in a teacher's head, in the instructor's head, it's very clear how they are linked, but that link is not clear to the students, and they don't know what he wants them to focus on. So again, this is information overload combined with there's no clear path to the instruction. There's no easy, let's say, step-by-step guide to follow what the teacher wants you to do as a student. So lack of structure is a really big thing, and I'll get to that in a little bit. And again, I'm not going to trash this teacher. Doesn't matter who it is. But the thing is that we all make mistakes as teachers, and we all have styles. And again, I'll get into that. So it's not about, trashing this guy's name or anything. It's just that this is an issue with many teachers. And if we want to be good teachers, we also have to recognize when we make mistakes. And for instance, just last Friday, I was training with my teacher, and I had clearly been doing a mistake for a long time now. Okay, well, that's on me then. So I'm like, okay, I did it wrong. One of my fellow students was doing it differently than I did, and I said, I think it's like this. And he said, I learned this way. I said, let's ask the teacher. He says, no, the other guy's right. And I said, okay, then I'm wrong. I don't know why I did this wrong, but I'm clearly wrong. Time to correct. So we all should be open to correction as teachers. Anyway, moving on, the second part of being unstructured is a little bit larger. So take a little bit of a bird's eye view, and that in one class, the techniques and the concepts that that instructor shows, they're all over the place. There's no clear overlap. There's no clear consistency as to what he's actually teaching. And that means that he teaches separate techniques, but and it's good, it's great, but that misses a chance to show the students how these individual pieces of the puzzle fit in the overall picture. And again, in the teacher's mind, it's probably exceedingly clear, but for the students, it's very difficult to follow. Again, they lack that overall picture unless you give it to them specifically. And now we get to a little bit of a more difficult aspect. I know that teacher is very good at some very specific things of the art that he teaches, as in really high class, international class level, like really, really good. But he's not very good at other aspects. Not very good being, again, relative, much better than obviously somebody who only has a few years of training, but that's not his strong suit. And his teaching reflects that. And it is reflected in the way he explains certain things, and then clearly lacks a deeper understanding. And again, that is fine. We all have limitations. And I did a podcast recently on, basically trying to, see what are your limiting principles. And this is one aspect of that whole discussion, is that as a teacher, you should understand, like, okay, I'm really good at this. I'm not so good at that. Go train with that guy if you want to learn that. Or there's nothing wrong with teaching it. We can't be specialized in everything, but then recognize that, okay, maybe I'm not as good as other people are. Maybe I'm not as good as I'd like to be. So how about I stick to some general principles, some, a good solid basis, and then try to help the students best they can, as opposed to digging deep into certain details, and then actually it turns out that the teacher's wrong about them. And one of the techniques that the young man showed to me, he explained that, the teacher said, okay, you have to do it this way, and it just didn't work. It simply didn't work. And I understand why he showed it that way, but again, due to this not being his specialty and him lacking certain amounts of experience in that field, it's an easy mistake to make as a teacher. Now, this is not problematic in and of itself. The problem starts when, because of that, and I think that is his biggest failing as a teacher, which I will call a failing, is that he gets angry at his students when they don't get it, or when they can't do it right, or they just can't make it work, because of all his experience and physical capabilities, he can make it work more or less, but that doesn't mean everybody can do that. Now, and then I get to a final point, the impression that I have, again, knowing this instructor a little bit, and then now knowing more about how he teaches, and I've also had this confirmed from other sources, is that, he teaches a lot of classes. And what it looks like to me is that it's a lot of taking techniques left and right, hearing something in a podcast, seeing something in a YouTube video, and then teaching it in class, without actually having this, how shall I put it, this overarching view, this experience through training and experience and learning and so on, of how that technique fits into the larger whole of what he's actually teaching. Now, my opinion has been pretty much the same for decades now on that. I could be wrong, but I don't think I am. When it comes to simply picking and choosing techniques from all over the place, you lack a coherence that is present when you have a system that has been built up from scratch, from the bottom, into something that sticks together like glue, meaning it's not just random techniques. Every technique is built upon the previous one, and there are clear principles in play. There are clear tactical and strategic guidelines. There is a context, and so on. So everything has been put into the curriculum for specific reasons, not just, well, it works. Well, sure, just simply because it works doesn't mean that you should teach it to everybody. Because why does it work? And in what context does it work? And does that actually conflict other things you teach? Or is it something that can work in harmony with the rest of your teaching? And if so, is that completely the case, or is it only partially the case? And if it's partially the case, how do you mitigate for the partial conflict that arises? Is it even possible to mitigate? Now, these are the things that I've been working on for many, many years now, simply because I felt I had to, because I learned and trained in several different styles. And instead of putting them all together in one big heap and just picking and choosing from them, making it a whole unorganized mess, I prefer to keep them separate. And as I've mentioned before, Randy's law, the differences are just as important as the similarities. And then trying to figure out how can I teach them the best possible way. I know very, very little other fields. In fact, I don't know any other fields in which such a practice would be acceptable, that you just pick from any other field that you think is relevant to yours and just add that to your curriculum. I don't see that happening in many universities. I don't see that happening in many professional courses that are taught in big companies and so on. Typically, there is a curriculum, and the curriculum is very much focused on what you need to learn. And it stems from experience and what is acknowledged in the field. Typically, not always, but usually. And it's not just, okay, well, I saw something in a completely different field. Now I'm going to use that here too. You could take a principle from engineering and say, well, I'm just going to add this principle from engineering, or this example, or this methodology from engineering. I'm just going to add it into martial arts training. But it could work, or it could be that there's a whole portion of it that is simply not relevant to martial arts. But if you're teaching it anyway, you end up overloading and overburdening your students with requirements that are just not necessary. So that's one example of how just picking stuff and adding it at random just because you think it's cool, or or it works well in a different field. I don't think it's a good idea. So That's a long explanation about this one instructor. And again, I'm not going to say that he's a bad instructor. That's not the point. It's just that we're talking about teaching, and by default, it also means learning. And I'm just going to talk about that. And there will be examples of instructors who aren't, as good as they could be when it comes to teaching. God knows that that applied to me very much so when I was younger. Hopefully a little bit less now, but I'm sure I still make mistakes. Like I just mentioned, I sometimes get corrected by my own teacher. It happens less than before, but it still happens. So again, a little bit of humility is a good thing. So it's in that spirit that I see that. Now, to give you a little bit of background and to move on, I've been teaching for over 30 years. It's actually quite a bit longer, but let's say officially, so to speak, teaching over 30 years. I've been a personal trainer for 27 plus years, and that's both in private classes, group classes, and seminars. So I do have a fair amount of experience because that's what I do pretty much every single day. Now, my opinion, and that is, I think the key point is that teaching is both a skill and a process. Now, what does that mean? A skill, it is something that you learn. It is an acquired skill. Some people are naturally gifted teachers, others not so much. Doesn't mean you can't get better, doesn't mean you can't make mistakes if you're naturally skilled. But it's something that you should learn and practice and try to improve upon. The other aspect is that it's a process, meaning you start as a beginning teacher, and I'll explain how I got started. You start as a beginning teacher, and you might not be all that great at it, or you might have been ending up being pretty good to begin with. But over time, as you teach more and more, you'll hopefully get better at it, and you will change. The way you teach will change over time. I teach in no way, shape, or form like I used to when I just started out 30 plus years ago. It's very, very different. Why? Well, because I changed and I got more experience and more understanding and so on. So that process is something you also need to account for. Now, again, to not give you the impression that I was trashing this other instructor, let's talk about me. I was extremely lucky to have had both poor teachers, not so good ones, and actually excellent teachers. In part, this is because back in the day when I started, there was very little choice. There was you practiced the martial art that was available to you, more or less. There wasn't as much as there is now. And the other aspect is that having experienced not so good teachers, I started searching for better ones and started to study up on and try to learn, well, what is actually a good teacher? How do you define that? What are some characteristics? And that is something that I want to discuss a little bit more now in this episode. So, as I just said before, as a caveat, when you want to go on the lookout for good teachers, all teachers are different, and if you teach, finding your own style and method of teaching, that's a lifelong quest. So again, that's the process. So it never stops. You keep on learning as time goes by. Now, for me, to give you an example, I rolled into it. So my teacher would say that, okay, Wim, you do the warm-up, and my teacher would arrive a little bit later in class because he had to travel a fair amount of distance to get to class. So I'd do like 10, 15 minutes of warm-up, he'd arrive, and he'd take over. And eventually that became like a full warm-up, and then eventually that became full classes. My teacher would only show up once or twice a week, and then once a week, and then I basically said, okay, you take over the school. So this process went on for quite a while. That took several years to get to that point. Now, I wasn't very good at first. I wasn't a great teacher at all. I just did what my teacher did and copied his approach. But his methods were, like we say now, old school. So some of the training methods were extremely harsh. As in, if I do that stuff nowadays, I think I'll get arrested. I'm not even joking that that stuff wouldn't fly nowadays. Just recently, I explained this to one of my private training students, and we were talking about, I don't know how we ended up on that topic, but we talked about old school methods, and I said, yeah, one of the things my teacher did, sorry, was that, we do conditioning and we do sit-ups back in the day. So that gives you, if you know something about abdominal muscle training, that sit-ups aren't all that great. And we'd have to do sit-ups, and he'd be standing in front of us. And as you came up out of the sit-up, he'd hit you with a stick, and you have to block that stick, or get hit in the head with that stick. So that's one example. There's so much more. I mean, now I think the term for that would be cruel and unusual punishment. But that was how it was back in the day, and I'm not complaining. But the point is that when it comes to training methods, there are far better alternatives, providing you understand how to teach correctly, what science has taught us about teaching correctly and efficiently, while distinguishing from methods and intensity. You can have an excellent science-based training methodology, but lack in intensity, with the result that you don't achieve the results you want with the students. Or you can have an extremely poor training methodology. However, you have very, very high intensity when it comes to training and achieve better results than the first example that I just gave. Ideally, you would like to have both the training methodology and the intensity tailored to the students and the type of class that you're teaching. But in my case, that wasn't so by far. I just wasn't very good. I just did what my teacher did, and his methods were, it wasn't all bad at all. It was just, there were some issues with that due to the times that we lived in back then. Again, this is a very long time ago. Now, another mistake I made was to teach the way I wanted to train. And this is in part because of the intensity of the classes that my teachers taught. That's just how he would teach. But also, I liked that kind of training. Not everybody is as motivated as I was. I would come home from class and I would train. I would continue training because I didn't want to forget what I just learned. Because I was very much not a good student in the sense that it didn't come naturally to me. I worked really hard. And there ended up being 3 classes a week, and I would obviously go to class. I'd arrive early so I could train a little bit more and repeat what we did last class. And also I'd train on the days there was no class. So I was very motivated, but not everybody is there for the same reasons. Nor is everybody as physically capable of doing what I did. I was very young, I was in good shape. Well, that's not the case for everybody. So you can't expect them to train the same way. Or people learn differently from the way I learn, or the way I learn best, and they just can't follow if you teach in a way that is good for some but not for others. And eventually I came to that understanding and improved as a teacher, where now I try to, as much as possible, adapt the training and the methodology to the student that is in front of me. Now, it's easy to do when you do private training like I do very much. It's a little bit more difficult to do when you have a group class, and it's very hard to do if you teach a seminar. I've done all of those for a long time, so you have to always adapt to the context in which you teach. But the point is that if you only train for the way you want to train, if you only teach, sorry, for the way you want to train, you're going to have a very different class and a very different result than if you're trying to teach as well as you possibly can for the largest possible audience. Very different focus. Now, back to my example. Fortunately for me, I understood that I didn't have a lot of knowledge, so I started studying, following courses and so on stuff like basic anatomy, physiology, training methodology, and so on. I would learn from others how to teach. I would look at different examples while still trying to find my own way. and over the years, try to always update my methods. If new scientific knowledge becomes available, I try to, see what's going on, see if it is actually just a one-off, or if there's a preponderance of evidence, as the lawyers like to say, that this is actually a better methodology than what we did before, and so on. So in short, you have to question as a teacher and on a regular basis that what you're doing, is that actually still worth doing, or should it be adapted? This is very much normal in other fields. For instance, I used to work for a company called Technogym. I was one of their master trainers for about 10 years. I worked with them, and it's perhaps the largest fitness company in the world. A lot of great products, and I would be sent to clients who bought one of their equipments, go to commercial gyms that bought a whole lot of stuff, and then or going to companies, hospitals, and so on to teach people how to work with that. Now, years ago, they developed a software suite basically on that you could use to run a gym, or basically use your own training in a much more methodical manner, meaning you could track what you're doing and so on, have a program available online, lots of stuff, but that was software training. Now, here's the thing. When you teach software to users, you always update your curriculum. Why? Because each new version, there are new features, or a feature is basically taken out because it's become obsolete, and so on. So you always have to adapt the way you teach. This is true for pretty much any other field. I wouldn't say always, but in most other fields, you will see that teachers update both their curriculum and their training methods as new information and new, let's say, new challenges become available to you, whether you want to or not. And I find that it's often in martial arts that people, particularly instructors who've been teaching for a long time, and again, I include myself in that category, it's often easy to just rely on, well, I've always done it this way, so why change? It works for me, and it's always worked, and this and that. Okay, I can understand that, and I don't disagree per se, only that I think if you want to maintain relevance, because life changes and contexts change, if you want to maintain relevance as a teacher, you should try to keep on learning. And I'll give you the example of one of my teachers, who was one of the best teachers that I've had, is Bob Orlando, the late Bob Orlando, who would teach Kuntao and Silat. And he said that after I noticed that he'd made changes to a technique that he taught me, let's say the year or so before, and he would say, yeah, the cement is never really dry in this place, meaning we're always changing, we're always evolving. And I think that's a good thing. Now, having said all that, there's another point that I want to put into focus, and it relates to the instructor that I was talking about in the beginning, but also to everybody. And that is, at which point in time you start working with that instructor, that can dramatically change your experience as a student. For instance, if he's young or if he's older. I'm almost 50 now. So if you would have trained with me 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you would have had a very, very different experience than if you train with me now. Why? Well, because I've changed. I've learned so much more. I think I'm a much better teacher now than I was back then, especially in the beginning. I think that's only normal. So at what stage of the process your teacher is at, that's going to change over time. And when you start working with the teacher, that's going to very much change your own experience. So keep that in mind when you train with somebody. There are many reasons for that. For instance, the focus of the teacher might change as he gets older or he achieves certain results. Let's say that you go to an MMA gym And when he's younger, the teacher is all about, I want to train as many champions as I can. And it's a very competitive gym. Maybe when he gets older, he doesn't want to spend all that time just training with guys who want to compete at the highest level. And he wants to focus a whole lot more on simply enjoying training or training the next generation of instructors. So becoming a teacher's teacher, or just do seminars and reach as many people as possible. Or he might just want to teach children. I've seen this happen with teachers who said like, okay, I just want to teach kids because they're so eager to learn and so on. So the focus of the teacher can change over time, depending again on at which stage of his teaching career that he is at. You will have a very different experience. Another example is going from commercial gym to, let's say, private training or semi-private training. I'll give you the example of my co-author, Lauren Christensen. I know because I've talked to Lauren about this. He had the whole commercial gym experience where he was teaching like huge classes, loads and loads of students. Now, as he got older, he basically stopped doing that and would teach a semi-private group, like a small group of students, invitation only, that would train in his garage, and that was it. So that is a huge difference. What does that mean? Well, if you want to, and I've given this advice in the past before, if you want to learn from somebody, don't wait. Because there's a reason you want to learn from that person at a certain point in time. Like I said, he might change his focus by the time you start training with him, or his training might no longer be available because he says, I'm no longer going to teach public classes. I'm only going to teach private sessions or semi-private, small group training, invitation only. You don't have an invitation, you don't get in. You might never get a chance again. So that is another example. And the final one I'll give, and there's so many more, but the final one is that as you get older as a teacher, there are certain things you can't do anymore because age takes them away from you, or it could be injuries. I used to love doing jumping kicks and jump spinning back kicks and so on. I was really good at that, especially for my weight. Well, not so much anymore because, getting older and again, a bunch of injuries make it so that I can still do them fairly well, but I can't train them hard anymore because I would, make my injuries worse. So I don't. So you don't see me do that anymore, or not as much. Okay, well then it's an aspect of the art that you won't get as much exposure to. Even if I still have that knowledge and experience, I'm not focusing on it as much anymore as I used to. So again, where is your instructor at in the whole process of his teaching career? Makes a huge difference. So that's a long explanation. I'm going to focus on something else now, just to give you guys some stuff to think about. And if you're a teacher listening to this, hopefully this is something that you can use. If you're not, you're just a practitioner, this is giving you a little bit of a peek under the hood of how teachers think, so that when you're in class or you want to learn something, maybe it's easier to understand what the instructor is trying to teach you if you have some of these categories in mind. So that's basically what I'm going to do. And this, by the way, is straight out of the outline for my Patreon project on teaching and learning martial arts and self-defense. So there's just elements that you can consider. It's not a definitive list because I'm still working on it, obviously, but keep this in mind. So for instance, teaching principles is a category. All right. Are there examples? Are there drills? And can you make a distinction between the two? For instance, you might want to show a concept. The concept of, let's say, center line. You might use a technique, an example of that really emphasizes this is how center line works. Or you can choose a drill that focuses on understanding center line. That drill does maybe one thing, or primarily one thing, and that is help you understand center line. Same thing for the example. So what that means is that a good teaching principle is that when you show something and you are talking about a concept, a principle, you choose the example or the drill that will illustrate that principle the best possible way for the student to get a basic understanding and begin his journey of learning more about that principle. And this is what I call, and I've stolen this from Brandon Sanderson in his writing course, heavy lifting sentences, heavy lifting drills, heavy lifting examples. What does that mean? Well, as much as possible, it's not always possible, but as much as possible, when you teach something, try to teach more than one thing at the same time, so that sometimes the students might not even understand that they're learning actually 4 or 5 things by practicing this example or this drill, but you only give the first thing they learn in the beginning, and then as they get more experience, you can point out like, look, the drill actually also teaches you this and this and this, and then when they are further down the line in their training, they discover that these things that they've been doing in that drill or that in that example of a technique for a long time now actually has more value than simply that specific thing you explained at the beginning. So a heavy lifting sentence basically comes to, and I'll try to give the example Brandon Sanderson gave, who's an author, for those who don't know, fantasy author amongst many other things. And he said, okay, you want to have your sentences do more than one thing so that you give a lot of information without making it some sort of information dump, which is bad writing. So I think it's something along the lines of the example that he gave was, if I'm not mistaken, Mike came to the gate of the castle and said, "Oh, this is a ward. I can't get in again." So what do we know? We know it's about Mike. He arrives at a castle. There's a gate. It's closed, so he can't get in. But he specifically can't get in because there's a ward. A ward is using magic. Again, this is Brandon Sanderson writes fantasy. And for some reason, that magic prohibits Mike from getting into the castle. And he says, again. So this has happened before. The again also gives an emotional value. It could, depending on how you write that sentence and the sentence that comes before or after, that can mean that Mike is annoyed, or he might be basically feeling defeated or disillusioned, or disappointed that he can't get in again, and so on. So that one sentence does a lot. That's why he calls it a heavy lifting sentence. When I teach, I try to, as much as possible, make it so that I show heavy lifting examples, techniques, drills, and concepts, so that it does more than one thing. This is why I believe that just picking and choosing, and this is one of the reasons why, but picking and choosing techniques from different styles just because they work well, they're effective, is not necessarily a good thing, because they do that one thing, but unless you place them in the larger context of everything else that you teach, it's going to be difficult to make it so that the student gets more bang for his buck, so to speak, when it comes to the technique that you just showed. It's not just a one-off, like, okay, in this and this and this context, this might work, and then we move on to something else. No, you show something and that technique actually fits into the larger whole, and it helps you prepare for what comes next, whatever that may be. So teaching principles. The next category of teaching is more focused on the teacher itself, and is what is the structure of your art? Okay, so what are the principles of your art? For instance, in the Tai Chi Chuan that I teach, there are very specific principles when it comes to physical movement, body mechanics. For instance, straight spine, but not always in a vertical position. Correct transfer of weight, making understanding the difference between weight transfer and stepping, coordinated stepping and turning, and a bunch of principles that are always present in the art. Do you know them? Do you know them all? If not, how can you teach? Because principles interact with each other. And sometimes, like laws, like in the legal system, principles will rub up against each other and kind of create friction where they're not entirely in harmony with each other, is a good way to put it. So you have to understand it as a teacher first, and your level of understanding will allow you to then, going back to the previous point, give good examples, show heavy lifting examples and drills and so on. Where, for instance, you want to teach a drill in such a way that it incorporates as many principles as is reasonable to do for the goal of that drill. Which means that the principles you're going to teach anyway, because they're an integral part of the art, you're showing them from the very first class that the student learns that drill. So that even if he doesn't have the understanding to see all the principles at play right away, like a few months down the line or years down the line, you can point to that drill. Remember that you first learned this, and I said it's this. Well, it's actually also this and this and this. And by now, you've been training that drill for so long that I can show you how the other principles are at play. If the student hasn't figured it out by himself at that point, because that also happens. So, what is the structure of your art or your system? Figure that out. And then principles and concepts. What are some concepts? For instance, when you teach, I call this the fundamental principles and concepts, and these are timing, distance, and orientation. So timing is when does something happen? From you, your opponent, doesn't matter, but when does it happen? Time is often measured in milliseconds. Why? Because when it comes to real violence, everything goes really fast, and time is very precious and very, very short. Fights can be over in seconds and less. So you have to understand when something happens. Did you do your technique before, during, or after a certain movement or a certain thing happens? You have to understand timing. Distance, same thing. You could be too close, you can be too far. Either way, if you're too close or too far, technique might not work. So what is the right distance? Well, that's going to change. Okay, distance management. So you have to learn that concept as well. Orientation means, well, very simple. You have to be oriented a certain way. In many cases, you have to be looking at your opponent or going towards the opponent. Not always, sometimes you turn away from the opponent as you do technique. So I can see many students making the mistake of going towards the opponent when they shouldn't, and vice versa. So these fundamental three concepts are something that is pretty much relevant to any art, but is often overlooked or assumed that, the student gets that. Because as a teacher or as a long-time practitioner, you're so used to figuring out these three because they always change. The timing, distance, and orientation against somebody my size is going to be different from somebody who is a lot bigger than I am or a lot smaller and lighter compared to you. And then sometimes they will attack a certain way that one of these three is going to be very much different, and sometimes they will only be slightly different. So they're constantly changing. Okay, you have to practice how to adapt to these. Another concept is center of gravity. It's a very simple concept. We have a center of gravity as human beings. It's not that difficult to figure out. Okay, how do we manipulate it? So concepts are a really big part of teaching. Another category is the class outline. If you have a very simple class outline, introduction, you start, warm-up, general warm-up, specific warm-up, and so on. Then there's the instruction part, then there's a cool down, and then class is dismissed with parting words if necessary. That is a really basic outline for a class or a training session. Each individual part that I just mentioned, you can divide up into more parts and go very much into detail. But do you have a class outline or not? Or are you just showing up to class and we'll figure out what we do here? I'm not saying it's wrong, but I prefer to have a little bit more structure. And if you use an outline, well, then you can actually be, again, more efficient in the way that you teach and get better results. And I'll point right back to everything I just explained about examples, heavy lifting, sentences, and so on. Another category and this category is one that I have a lot of experience with because I've been doing so much instructional videos, is instruction methodology. For instance, viewing angles. I constantly tell my students, okay, stand over here, or start here, or go look at this, because I know from working with video cameras for so long, is that you don't see certain things at a certain viewing angle. If my student is standing on my left and he should be standing on my right, and I don't tell him, he's not gonna see what I'm talking about. And many students just plant themselves on a spot, and then they don't dare walk around to see something else. I would constantly do that when I'm learning something. I just stand over there, and if I don't see it, or I'm like, okay, what's he doing with his left hand? Okay, I'll go stand on the other side of the student and of the teacher, and okay, that's what he's doing, right? I got it. Which is also why I typically show something left and right side, so that if there's a context in which students cannot really walk around much, or there's too many people in a class or in a seminar, so there's no walking around in a practical manner, I will show it from different angles. I will show it left side, right side, and if let's say that you're in a training hall that is the layout is a square, you will do it facing north-south, and then you will change 90-degree angle of positioning yourself and the demo partner, and you'll orient yourself east-west, so that everybody, regardless of where they stand, can get a pretty good view of what you're doing. Takes a little bit of adjustment in your head as an instructor, but this is like viewing angles is just a key part. In addition to that, you want to maybe have more detail, and they might have the viewing angle that is optimal for what you're showing, but they might not know what they need to pay attention to. Okay, you snap your fingers, or what I like to do is I'll move my hand like in the air, and then point to my own wrist. Look at the wrists right here. Look at this hand. This is how you grab it, and so on. You isolate movements instead of showing the entire technique. You ask your partner to take a step back and then show it without him, so that they can focus on you and not just the effect that the technique has on the partner, and so on. So drawing attention to detail that is important often avoids the most common mistakes. And that's why I like to do it. So that's instruction methodology. And then there's just so many more categories. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but I've been going so long for this episode already, so I want to basically get to the end. How do you correct students? Which kind of examples do you give? A lot of psychological, mental issues, learning methods, for instance, expectations. What should a student expect from class? Avoiding disappointment, so that students don't drop out of class, and so on. Drills, a lot of stuff we can say about how do you do drills at all? If so, which ones, how, and so on. I know so much stuff. The effects of adrenaline on performance, how to try to simulate these effects, using analogies, using case studies, nomenclature, which kind of words do you use in terms. If you teach an Oriental art, or if you teach a Western art to a non-Western audience, cultural issues, language issues. For instance, in my online Touch 1 course, I was just last month, I did a Q&A video on Chinese names for techniques. Why are they so weird sometimes? Well, it's cultural, language, and so on. And that helps in so that people don't make mistakes if you can explain that. What kind of teacher do you want to be? What kind of students do you want? What kind of school or dojo or gym do you want? And so on. So there's so many more categories of things when it comes to teaching. So again, this is all stuff for the great Patreon project. But I hope in this podcast that I've given you a lot to think about if you're a teacher. Hopefully something that you can use right away, or maybe that gives you some thoughts of, okay, maybe I can do it a little bit differently and experiment, and then your students might, in the best of all worlds, benefit from that. And if you're a practitioner, maybe you'll have now a better understanding of how how your teacher thinks, why he does things a certain way, and also that if something isn't clear, if you know more about it now because of all the things that I've explained here, that you understand how to ask better questions. which in my opinion as a student is the most critical thing. Don't just ask any question, ask a good question. Now, we always say there's no such thing as a stupid question. That's not true. There are really stupid questions. For instance, I used to have a student who was constantly asking questions. And it's not wrong per se, but it was more like a challenge of authority than anything else, because there was this one time, and that was the best example, as I was explaining something, he began asking a question, and the question he asked was answered in my previous sentence. And he hadn't been listening. He was just looking for questions he could ask me. He wasn't even paying attention. And I pointed to another student. Didn't I just say that like 5 seconds ago? He said, yes, you did. I said, there you go. And then that student's eyes got really big, like, oh, yeah, okay. So asking good questions as a student is important because it helps you understand the art better. You'll learn better, but also it makes you understand your teacher better. And if you understand what your teacher is trying to show you, how, why, and so on, you will make so much more progress. So the better the understanding between teacher and student when it comes to teaching methods and so on, the more progress everybody can make. And that was kind of the goal of this episode. Well, that's it. It went on for a long time. So what's coming up next? Next week there will be another You Are Not Aries podcast episode, and then tomorrow I have my interview with Lawrence Kane about the new book that he wrote with Chris Wilder, which is basically about martial artists and everything, about them. Kind of like it was a big survey, and I was part of that survey. So there's going to be a fun interview. You have that to look forward to. I have some more guests lined up, still at the scheduling stage, but it should be fun. All right, guys, as always, thank you for listening. If you want to help out, hit the like button, share with your friends, subscribe if you haven't already. Check out my Patreon, check out the donation page. Everything is in the show notes of this episode in the description. And I'll talk to you next time. Bye.